Now, it's 6 weeks, would you believe, since lockdown began. This week, the government will review the measures and decide whether it's time to ease restrictions. But what needs to change before ministers will stop saying stay at home? When a hairdresser's and other shops going to reopen, what about schools reopening and travelling on public transport? Well, let's catch up with Dr. Duncan Robertson from Loughborough University School of Business and Economics. Duncan, morning again.
Morning, Ben.
Now, look, you're an expert, amongst many other things, about modelling and so on. Is this what they're using to try to ascertain when it's safe to ease the lockdown?
That's right. There's quite a lot of modelling going on about, the spread of the virus and what interventions, you can use to actually prevent that from continuing. So we're still in that sort of modelling stage, and there's a lot to still know. For example, how far these droplets spread when you breathe. There's some work going on the sort of 2 metre boundary that we have. So there's a lot of work going on to actually understand how it's transmitted, and then to think about what you can do to release the lockdown.
And actually, talking about the lockdown, I know that the Oxford University's been developing this thing called a stringency index. What's that about?
That's right. So there are two things that the Blavatnik school in Oxford are doing. First of all, they're sort of comparing around the world to see actually how stringent these lockdowns are. So at the moment, we in the UK are in this sort of top end of lockdowns, and they're comparing different countries' responses to try and control this. So we're still at this relatively high stage, but we're not, if you think about some countries, they're preventing any sort of leaving the house apart from, once a week, for example, whereas, still we're allowed out to do exercise and essential trips, for example. So we're not really at the ultimate stage. So that's the first thing they do, is that sort of stringency index to see how stringent the lockdown is. We're still quite high.
And does that work give any sort of indication as to when the lockdown can not just be eased, but can be switched off, as it were?
Well, there's another stream of work that's mainly coming out of the World Health Organization. They have guidelines about when you can actually reduce, roll back this lockdown. So, for example, do you have the control of the transmission? Do you have isolation and testing in place? For example.
Oh, seem to have lost Duncan. No, we'll see if we can get him back. Problem with the telephone line. It's 25 minutes past 11. Ben Jackson with you through until 2 this afternoon. Also still to come for you, if we can manage to get Duncan back. We'll be talking to David Gleave, who's an aviation expert from Loughborough, about the future of aviation. We've heard lots of major airline companies suggested job layoffs and all kinds of things. We'll talk to David about that. And actually some of the logistics, what happens to the aircraft and so on if they've been sitting for that length of time. We've found Duncan again. I don't know what happened there, Duncan. Sorry about that.
I don't know. Someone locked me down. There we go.
So listen, you were just talking about the sort of the WHO rules or suggestions or guidelines as to when lockdown can be eased.
Yeah, exactly. Because what you don't want to happen is for this lockdown to be released and people go back about their daily business, and then you get this kind of second peak, which could be worse than the first peak, even though the first peak has been pretty bad. So going through a whole list of things that should be in place before you're releasing these measures. So for example, cases coming in from abroad. Do you have quarantine on those? So there's a whole list of things that the World Health Organization recommends should be done. And we're still, so using the data from 1st of May, we're still relatively unprepared for the release of the lockdown. They have, Oxford have us down as 33 out of 10 in the score. Oh. But so one thing we're doing really well at is this community understanding. So people, the fact that we're talking about this on air now means the community are very involved and lots of people understand what's going on. So that's great. We just need to get a little bit better, a lot better at testing and tracing, and also get these cases controlled. And after that, you can think about the practical measures about getting people back to normal-ish lives.
I don't know. I think it's the way my brain works, really. But I kind of envisage the lockdown essentially like a vehicle with the brakes on, if you like. And at some point, somebody's got to just click that brake off once, just let it edge forward a little bit. But presumably, you don't want it to run away.
Exactly. That's a very good analogy. I mean, the point is that if you release everything at the same time, it's, you can think of this car falling off a cliff and there's very little you can do about that. But so what you want to do is you want to kind of test various interventions, and then just to see the reaction to those interventions, and then you may have to lock down again. So countries like Japan are locking down, and the Netherlands released it and then are increasing it again. So you want to make sure that what you do doesn't have this kind of catastrophic effect. And the problem is, of course, that it's not as though you release the lockdown today and you see the what happens today, because it takes this delay to get between doing the changes in policy and releasing the lockdown, and then effects and people hospitalised and etc.
What about school children going back to school? Because presumably, there was talk about them not going back to school till September, and then there's been a lot of talk about getting them back to school maybe June-ish. Because presumably, if it was found that increased the rate that the virus is spread, then essentially there's another lockdown coming anyway with the summer holidays.
Well, exactly. I mean, don't forget that some of these measures do happen without us really imposing them. It was a very good point you made, that the summer holidays are effectively lockdowns from school. People don't generally go to school over that period. So, and I think that's, one of the things I think they're thinking about is not having all the school children go back on day one. You might have a small group go back and, ultimately, it sounds terrible, but you're sort of carrying out experiments as you go along about what happens to transmission as a result of these interventions.
And there are all sorts of logistics about that, aren't there? About the staff being exposed, perhaps the risk there, or the children to pass on to grandparents. I mean, there are a lot of things that people have got to get their head around.
I know it's not an easy problem, and it sounds because there are all these interactions, and it's not as you normally as kind of scientists you carry out an experiment and keep everything else under control, but of course here there are so many interactions, and people don't behave like cars rolling down hills, for example. They are very much, we're social people, and we don't always behave as modelers would like us to behave. So you can try and make the models more and more sophisticated, or you can just see what happens as a result. So there's still a lot to do.
And presumably that variability increases the further into this we get, because people, not unreasonably, there becomes more of a mental health problem, doesn't it? People have already been, in many cases, 6-8 weeks. In some cases, people have been effectively locked in their houses, and that starts to take its toll, if not already.
Well, absolutely. And I think the Chief Medical Officer made a good point. A few weeks ago, I was talking about what are we trying to do here? And, the Chief Medical Officer is basically saying what we want to do is we want to minimise excess deaths from not just from COVID-19, but also from other things like, cancer treatments that are being delayed and, as you say, mental health issues as well. So we're trying to minimise the effects across this period of time, not just minimising the COVID effects. And as you say, people are starting to react. So there's you get these press conferences in the government. One of the things that's happening is, for example, motor vehicles are slowly creeping up, so that people are starting to use their cars more than they did, when effectively nothing's changed, but people are just reacting and taking, thinking, I'm going to take a higher risk because that's going to do me good. And, what you don't want to do is everyone to do that at the same time.
Duncan, as ever, thank you ever so much for looking at the science behind all this for us, and we'll talk again next week if that's okay.
Perfect.